Hi, I'm your friend Claude.
And I am just Jamie.
And today we have assembled to pay tribute to Stan the Man Lee on this very special episode of the Nerd Bomber podcast.
Greetings, true believers. I'm Stan Lee, co-author of How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, and creator of Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk, and a whole caboodle of other comic book characters that my legendary modesty prevents me from mentioning. Now, I'll be your host and guide as we journey together along the rambunctious road to comic book artistry, which is to say, it looks like we're stuck with each other for the next little while.
The pop culture world got some sad news this week with the passing of Stan Lee at the age of 95. I suppose it shouldn't come as a surprise when somebody gets into their mid-90s. Every extra second you get is a bonus. But it was still pretty sad and emotional for a lot of people. There was definitely a lot of strong, like I said, emotional reaction across the internet.
Yeah, at this point anyway, I don't think that there's much of the pop culture landscape that was untouched by Stan Lee in one way or another. I was looking at YouTube today, kind of going back over his career and looking for things that were personally relevant for me. And I kind of saw, I guess, like the broad scope of it in a way I hadn't before. And he's essentially been kind of at least televised since like 1968. We're talking 50 solid years of being a visible presence. And you can't even wrap your head around the amount of generations of kids and their kids and their kids even that know this guy.
Yeah, and the evolution in the generations of sort of the pop culture content that is spun off of what he originally created. From his sort of his core creations of the 60s, which we'll go over a little later probably, that spun into movies and into TV shows and into other forms of media. And even his personality became, him as a personality became this well-known figure that extended way beyond the boundaries of what he initially created. He became, I don't want to say he was a character himself, but actually the Onion of all places had a really good headline, and I'm not going to be able to remember the exact wording of it, but I thought it was actually really appropriate, and I think Stan Lee would even think it was funny. And it was like, I said something like, Stan Lee, creator of beloved Marvel character Stan Lee, dies at 95. And I think there's really some truth to that.
I don't think it's much of a stretch to say that for a lot of people, probably myself included, his stories and the ones he helped to shape are in many ways equally, if not more, influential than even the Bible. It sounds like hyperbole, but especially in an increasingly secular age, there's just as many people growing up with the characters and the scenarios that sprang from Stan Lee's imagination and those of his peers than there ever was with, the same kind of fables from the Bible.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. I mean, even like sort of his most famous line, which is with great power comes great responsibility, has become part of like the moral framework and the vernacular of our culture. And I think a lot of people might be aware that comes from Spider-Man, but I think a lot of people probably have heard that and sort of believe it as a not so much a trope, but as a proverbial truth without even realizing that comes from sort of this comic book background.
Yeah, if you go online and look up Stan Lee quotes, you'll get quite a few. And I don't know if that's a mark of a great person, but certainly an influential figure. His career was, I don't know exactly how long, but I mean, we're talking, over 5 decades solid of continuous, presence.
He started working for the ancestor of Marvel, what's name I forget at the moment. Timely. In his 20s. Or like even maybe like right around 20. So we're talking since the 1940s here.
Yeah, so
when he originally started, he wasn't really creating at that point. He was just sort of a gopher. He was filling inkwells and erasing pencils and doing things like that. But he did get a little bit of writing work early on. One of his first co-creations was a character called the Destroyer for Mystic Comics. Mystic Comics was not the brand; it was the name of a certain line, kind of like Amazing Stories or whatever. It appeared in Mystic Comics number 6 in August of 1941. So at that time, he was only 19 years old. So that was technically his first co-creation. But I think his creative abilities obviously did not blossom until you get to his real prime, his golden age, so to speak, in the 60s. Because Fantastic Four was 1961, and that was sort of when he really broke out and created sort of his brand of characters, and we'll talk more about what that really means later. The next year, in 1962, he created Spider-Man, which was probably his best-known creation and the thing that's forever connected to him. And again, that quote, "with great power comes great responsibility," comes from Spider-Man. Then the next year, 1963, was a big year. The X-Men was created, along with Iron Man, Doctor Strange. And then throughout the 60s, there were a lot more characters that he created. I mean, he basically created the Avengers, and all of the characters within the Avengers would crop up in the 60s. And Black Panther in 1966, which was obviously a big deal in terms of, black representation in comic books. He even retooled Captain America, which was a character that came from the 40s. He brought him into the fold of the Avengers and sort of, it created a new way of storytelling, because Captain America was from that old school superhero style where he was, the all-American guy, and if there was ever trouble, he was just going to deal with it. But he did something that was very Marvel-y, and he brought him into this sort of time jump where he awakens in the 60s, and now there's a new set of problems, a new set of challenges. He's a man out of time, so to speak. And it was just a very sort of typical way of doing things in terms of the way he wrote stories and wrote characters, but very relevant to the time.
Yeah, I think it probably started right out of the gate with the Fantastic Four, where the early genesis of the style that both Stan Lee and later Marvel became known for kind of started with Stan Lee's partnership with Jack Kirby. Lee was kind of the writer and the idea man, so to speak,
right,
and Jack Kirby would bring them to life visually. The Fantastic Four in particular probably was first because it was sort of loosely based on something that Jack Kirby had already done called The Challenges of the Unknown. And, that was published by DC Comics. But from there, both Stan Lee and Jack Kirby kind of took the same approach to, like you said, the X-Men and Iron Man, also the Incredible Hulk, Thor. So, I mean, those two guys immediately, gave life to some of the most hugely recognizable and influential characters and long-lasting characters in all of comics history.
Right, and it was kind of the style. There's been sort of this idea that Stan Lee didn't give proper credit, but really, even when he talks about things, he talks about his co-creators. And the thing that people don't realize about comics, at least in those days, and right up really through the 90s, was that an artist or writer who created a character and put it into a comic book had no legal right to that character. Stan Lee is forever associated with the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man and the X-Men, etc., but he has no legal claim to those characters. He does not own them. And so it really was not within his power at that stage in his career. He was not this sort of powerful executive editor type figure to, go around and make sure everybody knew, who did what. His name was on the comic because he wrote it, and Jack Kirby's name was on it because he drew it. In the case of Spider-Man, it was Steve Ditko. Very much the same process. So I think that's better understood now, that really it wasn't sort of some sort of malevolent thing Stan Lee was doing to take all the credit. And the co-creative process at Marvel was well known, like you said, sort of pioneered at that time and continued to be the way things were done for a long time and became known as the Marvel way. The other unique thing about sort of the Marvel way, and an important part of what Stan Lee changed about comic books, was that a lot of his characters were flawed characters. They were not, I don't want to diss on Superman, but for a long time he was the stand-up all-American guy who always knew what the right thing to do was and always knew how to do the right thing. And a lot of the characters that Stan Lee would later create in the 60s didn't always know what the right thing to do was. They didn't always know how to do the right thing. they were flawed. It started sort of a little bit more subtly maybe with the Fantastic Four, with even just sort of the character of Johnny Storm being a little bit, I would say, he was a flyboy. I mean, yes, he flew, but he kind of was a little bit impulsive. He was an impulsive character. He argued with the Thing. They didn't always get along. They had family, I don't want to say drama, but they had family contentiousness within their group of 4 people. This continued with Spider-Man. He was a teenager struggling to figure out how to, help Aunt May pay the bills and make friends and maybe attract a girlfriend and also be Spider-Man, and not getting enough sleep and not being able to perform as well at school as he should, and trying to maneuver through these relationships and life circumstances. And a lot of times, a lot of the character building was done through this sort of mundane, everyday problems that these characters were having to navigate in their regular lives, not just in their superhero lives. The next stage of that happens with the X-Men, where you start to deal with a lot of analogs to bigotry. The X-Men were a none too subtle nod to social messaging about equality and equal rights and things of that nature, where you had this group of people that were discriminated against because they were born different. The X-Men, the big thing with the X-Men is that they were mutants. They were born with their power. They didn't attain it through radioactive spiders or gamma ray bombs or anything like that. And so there was a lot of messaging there. And then, of course, this came to a head when he created Black Panther, which, again, was one of the first sort of black comic book superheroes. And that sort of took on some of these social challenges, directly.
It's funny that you mentioned specifically that the X-Men were created to be different from the heroes before that had gotten their powers through, radiation or some form of that. I actually was watching a clip earlier today where he also says that making the X-Men mutants was kind of out of laziness, just because of the fact that he didn't have to explain it. It was just a mutation.
Right. Well, another thing that that I heard him in a different interview, I think this might have been talking to Larry King just a few years ago. I think he was 92 in this interview, talking about how Spider-Man became really popular for people because he was entirely covered. So there's really no way to know. I mean, you know who Peter Parker was, but sort of from a street level perspective, if this was a real thing, the Spider-Man character, there's no way to know what he looks like under the costume. And so a lot of, a wide demographic of people were able to attach themselves to Spider-Man for that reason. And, he states openly that he didn't plan it that way. He wasn't thinking of it that way. But they were able to sort of take advantage of that within the context of the storytelling in subtle ways.
It's funny that you bring that up, and maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit here, bringing up a personal Stan Lee memory of when I was first introduced to him early on. But they actually bring that aspect of Spider-Man up in the episode of Muppet Babies that he appears on.
I did not know he appeared on Muppet Babies.
Indeed he did. And the episode is kind of Spider-Man focused, where all the Muppet Babies kind of take turns playing Spider-Man. And she said, well, now I'm going to talk about the adventures of Spider-Girl. And of course they make it a point to say, well, it's Spider-Man. He's not a girl. And she distinctly says, well, you don't know who's under the costume or who's under the mask, so it could be anybody. And they would go, oh, well, you have a point.
That is so great. That's such a great illustration of both the whole idea with Spider-Man being unknown, and also the greatness of the Muppet Babies as well.
Exactly.
Which has been mentioned before on the show.
Hey, you kids. Cut that out. Don't you know there's only one Spider-Man?
Sorry, Mr. Yu. Come on, Wolf. Let's get out of here.
Oh, boy.
It is the gift that keeps on giving in a lot of ways. But yeah, that was probably my first actual memory of seeing what Stan Lee looked like. I had heard his voice earlier on, like, introing Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends and the Incredible Hulk cartoons. But in this one, there's a gag where they are shooting webs and the webs start to... But yeah, so yeah, even in the 80s, they were kind of trying to point that out. the aspect of Spider-Man can be anybody.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so that sort of just summarizes the whole way that Stan Lee approached comics from a different perspective, which was to make, yes, these people were super powered, but they were still people, and they had issues they had to deal with, along with the space monster or the tyrannical overlord or the indestructible, creature from the deep, whatever the problem might be at the time. But they still had to pay their bills and go to family dinner, and their girlfriend just broke up with them, etc. So that was like the big difference. But I mean, I think we can take your Muppet Baby story and kind of dive into our personal connections to Stan Lee.
My very first memory of Stan Lee's voice was I used to love the crap out of Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, and he would do the intros to every episode.
Face front, heroes. This is Stan Lee. Believe it or not, you asked for today's story.
It's a very weird combination of characters on that show. It was like Spider-Man and Iceman and Firestar.
It was originally supposed to be Human Torch instead of Firestar.
Uh-huh.
So it was Spider-Man with fire and ice, basically.
Gotcha.
But there was, because Marvel didn't fully own Human Torch, because he was also an existing character prior to Marvel.
Yeah, actually one of the first comic book characters going way, way back.
So they had to come up with a different fire-wielding character, and that's where Firestar was created specifically for the show.
Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, Iceman and Firestar.
It wasn't until years later that reading things like Wizard Magazine and other things that I can't recall, but I gather that there was this sense that people thought that the cartoon was a little absurd or just lampoonable.
Right.
I mean, maybe, but not more than anything else at the time.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, it was a cartoon of its time. I think that's pretty clear.
I still love it.
And then the Incredible Hulk cartoon you mentioned.
Yeah,
I didn't watch either of these shows.
Oh, so good. It's just, we obviously talk a lot about cartoons from our childhood on this show, and I think the reason that pop culture and society still talks about these cartoons as well is that they are just such a pure version of these characters. And that's kind of what I'm after. I don't like a lot of reimaginings, as we've also expressed. But I think that between the visual style of these cartoons and having somebody like Stan Lee introduce them to you with such enthusiasm and passion, it just left a mark on you when you were, I think I could have been older than 3 or 4 when I first started seeing them.
Right.
So, that just has stuck with me for 30 years now. 30 plus years. And I think that speaks to kind of the power of, I guess, his personality and communication style.
Right. Yeah, well, my first experience with Stan Lee was, sort of reading some of the comics that he was responsible for. I was not a comic collector as a kid, but I've mentioned before that I did have this sort of random collection that had a lot of stuff from all kinds of different time periods. And so not only was I reading some of the stories that he would have written, I was also reading a lot of Stan's soapboxes from the editorial pages of Marvel Comics. Now, the editorial page that Stan's soapbox appeared on ran from like 1965 to 2001. He wrote on it, I think, pretty much every single one between 65 and 80 or 81. And then for the next 20 years, it was sporadic. He would write every now and then. He would contribute to it. It's actually famous for an essay he did in 1968. Which was right at the sort of peak of the social rights movement, social equality, equal rights movement, which was sort of all about bigotry and racism. And a lot of that, from Stan's soapbox, came a lot of his sort of catchphrases. like True Believer and Nuff Said and Excelsior, Make Mine Marvel. He would mention, the distinguished competition, which was DC, but he would also call them Brand Ech. And then he would make a lot of jokes at the expense of Irving Forbush, which was a fictitious Marvel staffer that he would sort of, I guess he was using him as an analog for just kind of picking, so he didn't have to pick on a specific person, I guess. So I became familiar with his sort of style of writing and his way of expressing himself by reading sort of a random collection of Stan's soapboxes from all kinds of different comics over the years. And then the next thing that I became really familiar with his voice, but not the voice that you hear, but the voice through which he writes, was 1978's How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, which was illustrated by John Buscema.
Let's start with the basics. And what can be more basic than having an artist teach us how to draw? Certainly better than a plumber. And what artist can be better suited to this titanic task than my co-author and good buddy, none other than John Buscema?
Thanks, Dad. Now let's draw comics.
The Marvel Way.
I remember flipping through that in the library at school a lot. I had my own copy. I still have one to this day. And that was a big part of my experience with Stan Lee, actually, which is sort of specific and not really super connected to his actual writing work. But for me, it was really important, both because he had that sort of certain Stan Lee sense of humor in the writing, but also because I always liked to draw. And this was sort of a big deal in sort of that habit or hobby, I guess.
Yeah, that book and its importance can't be overstated for my appreciation of Marvel and comics and Stan Lee either. I also used to get it out of the library constantly, and I think that it represented kind of the next logical step for people like us,
right? Or
for comic book and superhero fans who are also very into drawing and art and the minutia of what actually goes on. And a book like this was equal parts entertainment and also instructional manual. It lifted the curtain aside so you could kind of get a glimpse into how these things are done, but just enough so as not to make it seem, mundane or make you lose your appreciation for the magic of it all.
Right.
I actually don't somehow own a copy of the book, but I do have a video companion to it on DVD, which...
This I don't have.
Yeah, I didn't know it existed for years and found it randomly in Walmart it was bundled with a couple of the Incredible Hulk TV movies.
Oh, nice.
Which, ironically, is also where Stan Lee's famous cameo started.
I have one more thing with my personal Stan Lee experiences that were sort of important to me, and that was the Marvel Action Hour.
And now, more Marvel action on the Marvel Action Hour, featuring fabulous tales of the Fantastic Four, starring Reed Richards as Mr. Fantastic, Sue Richards as the Invisible Woman, Johnny Storm as the Human Torch, and everybody's favorite ever-loving blue-eyed thing, Benjamin J. Grimm. And now, Mr. Marvel himself, Stan Lee.
Hi, true believers. You may think you know the origin of the Fantastic Four, but until you see the far-out version we have waiting for you, you've only scratched the surface. And no dyed-in-the-wool Marvelite wants to be a surface scratcher, right?
This came much later than Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends and the Incredible Hulk cartoon that you're talking about. This ran from 94 to 96. And for the biggest chunk of that time, it was an Iron Man. It was an Iron Man cartoon and a Fantastic Four cartoon. But the Stan Lee experience within that was very similar to the one you described earlier, which was just him doing sort of intros and outros and voiceovers, and all of them would say "Hey, true believers," and then he'd go into his whole spiel, and just hearing the voice. Well, that was a very sort of very visceral experience and something that's really ingrained in my memory to this day.
The Marvel Action Hour was pretty important in my household growing up as well. It kind of just extended that experience of the earlier cartoons into another decade and, gave me a way to see that kind of thing at an age when I could truly appreciate it. Yeah, I absolutely loved it too. I think me and my brother were glued to the TV most times for that. And also it kind of established that for a 90s audience and carried into the well-loved Spider-Man mid-90s cartoon that came out on Fox, which Stan Lee ended up actually making an appearance on in animated form.
I got to look up all these sort of animated times he pops up, because I've not really, at least I don't remember them well in terms of the things that you've mentioned.
Right. Well, there's there's a ton of them. Some of them even in non-Marvel properties.
Right.
But in this particular Spider-Man episode, it's pretty cool because it finally kind of unites the creation Spider-Man with the creator Stan Lee, and it also features Stan Lee's wife Joan as Madam Web, a character that she kind of did recurring times on the show. So, then they make tongue-in-cheek references where Stan says, "Oh, who is that beautiful exotic lady?"
Of course.
So yeah, I thought that was fun. It's fun to go look back on.
It's interesting because a lot of his sort of latter-day fame has come from the infamous cameos.
Right.
And then we'll get to those in a little bit. And the cameos even started, like you said, he popped up in the Incredible Hulk TV movies. I think he was on the jury in the trial of the Incredible Hulk.
Yep.
And some of the animated cameos. But even before that, because he was significant enough a figure that in 2001, a company that he had never really worked for, DC, brought him on to do a Just Imagine series. And he did these sort of, if Stan Lee had created Superman, if Stan Lee had created Batman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, The Flash, a whole slew of DC characters, and he did these sort of one-shot Stan Lee versions of these characters. And this was before he sort of became, I guess he was always a household name, but his level of fame because of the whole cameo thing, and thanks largely to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but even a little bit before that, has really skyrocketed him. Even then, he was a significant enough a figure that DC would bring him in as an 80-year-old man to just do like these sort of novelty pieces for them. So it's just sort of an illustration of his significance to the industry.
Yeah, I don't think you ever saw the reverse of that happening. You don't see Bob Kane's Spider-Man anywhere.
No. It'd be interesting to see that, but you don't.
But yeah, Stan Lee's pop culture presence and his influence on society, certainly in the comic book industry, you just can't overstate it. And even after, he ceased being a Marvel employee in terms of the editorial process for the comic books, they kept him on, basically. They called it Chairman Emeritus. Basically, it's an ambassador position where they still paid him $1 million a year to essentially be a mascot.
Yeah.
And that's another, you kind of have these periods in Stan Lee's career where you can almost draw a clear line where there's a shift that occurs, whether it's from his early days as an assistant into a writer, into a creator, into an editor, and now into kind of a brand ambassador, basically.
Yeah, and there was a period like in the 80s where he was sort of a liaison between the comic book industry and Hollywood, and the whole TV movie aspect of things that started happening in the late 70s and 80s. He, that was also like an entirely sort of independent segment of his career.
Yeah, I think it's, we've talked about off the air how there's a case to be made for Stan Lee's greatest character or creation being Stan Lee. And, I think there's some truth to that. He helped to co-create all these legendary characters, and he included himself. And I think the period where he becomes kind of the version we all know today, it's easy to see certain influences. I would say he's equal parts P.T. Barnum, Colonel Sanders, Walt Disney, and even little Mr. Rogers in there.
I think that's a pretty good summation, really.
Yeah, you get your kind of corporate spokesperson element. You get your kind of, depending on your age, fatherly, unclely, grandfatherly, even warmth. And you get your, your creative...
Your real, creative
fountain.
Street cred. It is really a factor. It's not just that he did a couple things and became famous in spite of it. Like, the things that he did were very legitimately groundbreaking.
Yeah, it's not based on empty promises. It's based on, real accomplishments. And that's, I guess, all of these things kind of come together to make him such a unique and probably, the kind of presence that we're unlikely to ever see again.
There's very few. This brings me to a topic that we had discussed before, too. I mean, there's very few figures like him that became sort of their own personalities due to both their creative work and their time sort of as an executive-y, sort of steering the ship type of figure, and even being a little bit of a mascot for their brand, whatever that brand may be. And P.T. Barnum that you mentioned is an interesting case that I hadn't thought of. There's other names that I have considered, but there's really only two on here that I think are in his class in terms of that sort of very unique, known in his own right for both his creation and his visibility. And those are Walt Disney and George Lucas.
Yeah.
Maybe certain niche fandoms could make a case for Steven Spielberg or Gene Roddenberry or some video game prodigy, but I think those are the two pretty legitimate ones that reach and are known, household names across any spectrum of people. Walt Disney's probably at the top of the list, but just underneath that, I think our Stan Lee is there.
Yeah.
So we've mentioned a couple times that, the cameos have been a big deal too, and it's true. And like I said earlier, they started with cartoons, they started with some of the TV movies, but they really became these pop culture moments in the 2000s. He started doing cameos in the Spider-Man movies, the Fantastic Four movies, and then, of course, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, Avengers world. He starts popping up in all these movies, and they become these sort of like moments that we all look for and look forward to. And that's what really launched him into a level of fame, I think, that really sort of surpasses anything comparable, like I said, except for maybe Walt Disney, where he's not just known for his comic book creation. He's also known as this like figure that pops up, and there's such a layered significance to that, because like the casual fans now know who Stan Lee is, and they learn that he is the guy who's responsible for these characters, or largely responsible for these characters at least. And then to even like the sort of the really know-it-all comic book nerds, you start to recognize Stan Lee for these cameos, because he's the creator of he's basically the creator of the Marvel Universe. The Marvel Universe has a hierarchy, and there's gods and things like that, but Stan Lee is seen as like this sort of fourth wall breaking ultimate god of the Marvel Universe. And then he pops up in the movies, so there's this like multi-layered reality of him showing up, that he is like literally the creator of these characters and the in-universe god that created this world. And so maybe that's getting a little bit too nerdy for most of the casual fans and most people who know who Stan Lee is, just sort of offhandedly. But I think it really became this sort of like fun, significant thing that was happening, and now that era will come to an end, and I think it'll be lamented.
Yeah, I mean, even casual fans are aware of the recurring Stan Lee appearances in these Marvel movies. I believe they have recorded one last one for the next Avengers movie.
I heard that, yep.
Some people are saying that there are a bunch already recorded for future movies, but I'm pretty sure it's confirmed that it's only the Avengers one.
I've heard that rumor. I mean, you could probably construct things out of like, cuts and edits and CGI, but I don't think anybody would really want to see that.
No, I'm hoping they don't do that.
I think like, his picture on a billboard, for like the Stanley Lieber Law offices or something like that might be a fun Easter egg in movies, but I don't need to see like CGI Stan Lee pop up.
Right.
One fun thing kind of maybe worth mentioning is that since 1977, there has been a daily comic strip of Spider-Man running from 1977. And that entire time, including right up to the present, Stan Lee has been listed as the author. I don't know how much writing he's been doing. I mean, probably not that hard to outline a whole year's worth of comic strip, because you figure in a year they probably only produce one issue worth of imagery. But so the last strip that will be credited to Stan Lee, unless they're reprinting old stuff, ran on Friday, November 9th. So it's just kind of another interesting, melancholy reality and worth mention and recognition, I think. but I think it would be nice for that to continue, because in the comics you have the Amazing Spider-Man, Web of Spider-Man. I think at least in a daily newspaper print, it would be nice to see something like Stan Lee's Spider-Man or something like that run continuously. You could reprint that forever.
Yeah, it's true. It's interesting that, that's the topic at the heart of what you're talking about is, him being credited, or just, like a creator, an author, or, the person responsible getting credit. Because maybe the most lasting legacy he had to give to comics, besides everything we've mentioned, is that he originated the practice of putting, like, the credits in the beginning of comic book issues, of telling you who the inker was, who the penciler was, who the writer was.
Ah, interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, apparently that all started with him in the early 60s. So, yeah, I guess it all kind of ties together there somehow neatly. And it's a very cool thing that is still done to this day, and I can't imagine it would ever stop.
No, I mean, I think that's vital, and it's part of how I even approach, what comics I want to look at.
Exactly.
Is knowing that information. So that's great. And it serves as a nice sort of counterbalance to the idea that he took too much of the credit in his day, that he was the one responsible for making sure everybody knew who did what.
Very true.
So good for him.
Yeah, actually another story that kind of is a favorite of mine, just in the research of him, that kind of reinforces that point even further, is that during the production of one of the Spider-Man movies, I don't know which one, I can only assume it was the first one, the first Sam Raimi, Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movie. He was asked to kind of review the script and, critique it or give his notes. It was a kind of a sign of respect to the creators,
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about this? And apparently he basically just kind of looked it over, took a cursory glance at it almost, and basically said, have fun, I'm sure you'll do a great job. And really didn't really give any critiques or anything too serious. And I guess they were kind of like, are you sure? And he said something to the effect of that it was someone else's turn now, and who was he to stick his nose in?
Yeah. I've heard him say similar things when he was talking about the movies, the various movies coming out. What do you think of the movies? What do you think of where they're taking these characters? Where do you see these characters going? And his comments are always along the lines of, I like them all equally. I wish luck to the creators. I know they'll do a good job. I trust them. I love them. And he would say similar things about the fans, and then he really grew to appreciate the fandom and the act of entertaining people as a worthwhile endeavor, and just a lot of positive messaging overall. And that's where the little Mr. Rogers, Bob Ross thing comes in, where overall, like his message later, not that it was ever not his message, but later in his life, his message was just about appreciating all of it and not being cynical about it.
Yeah, and really just kind of staying humble overall too. I mean, I think that all of that is really key to his longevity and key to him being kept in the loop, I guess, from a corporate standpoint. I mean, the company could have very easily shut him out years ago if they wanted to.
Yep.
But, I mean, these things come down to probably financial realities and other things that we don't want to necessarily get too deep into as well. But the fact of the matter is that, he kind of set an example for everybody to follow. Like, he didn't try to maintain some sort of strict control over his creation and be iron-fisted about it. He was very open, he was very benevolent, and he was very accepting of the fact that things kind of move on. And I think that allowed him to be seen as collaborative and inclusive from the standpoint of whoever was in charge at that point, at all the various points throughout the years.
Yeah.
And, I think it's a great example for all of us to follow.
I was just going to say, I think a lot of people who are fans of pop culture franchises and sort of fandom in general could really take something from that and learn to appreciate the change and evolution that is inevitable with these characters and franchises, and try our best to remain positive and give everything a chance.
And I think that's going to bring us to the end of our special Nerd Bomber tribute to the career and the influence of Stan Lee. I have been your friend Claude.
And I've been just Jamie.
Until next time, true believers.
Excelsior!
I guess one person can make a difference. Enough said.